Savior, I come, quiet my soul. Remember, redemption's hill, where your blood was spilled for my ransom. Everything I once held dear, I counted all.
Our nation's history includes the struggle of white men to remain on top, in power. Following Jesus seriously, which Christians should seek first and foremost, means giving up our desire for power. We must be willing to speak truth at personal risk. Am I willing to walk that path that Jesus or Martin Luther King Jr. or John Lewis walked?
Lead me to the cross.
I'd like to welcome you to our fourth session on anti-racist Christianity, a crucial discussion or crucial conversation on racism. And our guest presenter today is a dear friend of mine, Don Addis. And one of my colleagues defined friendship as those people that you have shared a meal with in their home. So Don definitely fits into that category. His wife and I and my daughters and I have shared meals together, and we've also worshiped together as he was a part of the music ministry at the church that I was on staff in the San Diego County area. Don is a dear friend. I think Don is a very deep thinker as well. So I look forward to the insights that he will offer us from his perspective on chapter 4 of White Fragility, which is entitled, How Does Race Shape the Lives of White People? Don's resume is, in his resume, he describes himself as a person who has not mastered many things in life. In fact, he says the one thing that he can claim fame to mastering is his own imperfection. So that is the standpoint from which Don will present to us today. I'd like to begin each session with a quote, and this is the quote that I think fits well with our topic for today. And the quote is taken from Peggy McIntosh, who is a professor, and she says this: as a white person, I realized I had been taught about racism as something which puts others at a disadvantage, but had been taught not to see one of its corollary aspects, white privilege, which puts me at an advantage. Many, perhaps most of our white students in the United States think that racism doesn't affect them because they are not people of color. They do not see whiteness as a racial identity. In my class and place, I do not recognize myself as a racist because I was taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness by members of my group, never in invisible systems conferring unsought racial dominance on my group from birth. With that, I present to you our co-presenter for today, Don Addis. Don?
Thank you, Pastor Davis. It's my pleasure to be here today, and hopefully what I share helps you all, at least with chapter 4. As any of you might have read my bio, other than being confused because it didn't read like a normal bio, you realize that I'm a blatant realist. I seek truth. I embrace confession as the critical first step to emotional and spiritual health and wholeness. I've learned that unless I realize, admit, and confess my failures and limitations, many of you will be comfortable calling these sins, I'm held back by their associated burden and weight. So it was with some anticipation that I accepted Pastor Davis's invitation to be involved in the study of racism. Not having yet read White Fragility, I did not know what to expect, but I assumed I'd be learning more about others than about myself. As Robin states on the top of page 55, because of my white upbringing, it is easy for me to believe that, and I quote, racism is not my problem. As long as I haven't done anything against another race, racism is not an issue. Yet as I read White Fragility, I was made aware of how my privileged white upbringing and life were and continue to be in contrast to people of color. While I found Robin's insights and indictments enlightening, I became more confused about what racism really means to me, my role and responsibility in this racist society, and what my response to this new understanding should and will be. My goal for today's session is to model for you and encourage openness to exploring a topic that can indeed be uncomfortable, difficult to grasp, and even elusive. As Robin articulates so well, it is easy for those of us who are white to insist that we're not racist, because we're not actively racist, nor do we feel racist. This is the first difficult hurdle to clear so that we can be receptive to her inputs. So if you'll indulge me, allow me to share my own life review in response to this challenge as presented in chapter 4. The first 8 years of my life were lived in New Jersey, the son of a Baptist minister. Before I could read, I learned songs like Jesus Loves the Little Children. You know, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. So my Christian education was one of inclusion. However, I don't recall any blacks attending my father's church. When I was 8 years old, we moved to Augusta, Georgia, where my father planted the first American Baptist church south of the Mason-Dixon line. Again, while inclusion was the intent, because of the times and the very modest lower middle class neighborhood we lived in being predominantly white, I recall no black members. Just as my rich friend Philip from 6th grade lived up the hill in a more affluent neighborhood, I understood that the blacks lived a little further down the hill from us. This was my first exposure to an understanding of economic stratification of society, and the racial segregation seemed more economically than racially motivated. On page 66, Robin explains this impression of mine in more detail. How whites in lower economic levels often have less segregation from blacks because of the more closely aligned economic existence. But as I will elaborate on later, it was far easier for me to rise out of that being white than if I were black. I recall one Thanksgiving, our family attended a service at a local black church, the pastor of which my father knew. My recollection is that we were welcomed by them, albeit with some wondering what we were doing there. It was my first experience being the minority in any situation. I mention this to emphasize a point Robin makes on page 54 about the psychic weight of race that we whites do not carry. While we understood we'd be an oddity at that service, we did not have to worry about how we were going to be perceived in the same way a family of 5 blacks would have in attending an all-white Southern Baptist church in that town. We as whites did not carry the psychic weight of race. For more on this sort of Christian racism and the most segregated hour of the week, see page 65. There were blacks that attended my grade school, though it was predominantly white. During the heat of the summer, me and my friends would go to the local community pool, and blacks were allowed there, though I was aware that some whites were not happy about that. This was during the mid to late 60s, and I was not unaware of what was going on around the country. Against the civil rights turmoil and struggle witnessed on TV, the local Southern pride overtones rang out loudly. The Civil War was referred to by them as the war between the states. The North did not win, and it was not about slavery. As a good Yankee, and already my search for truth developing, I knew they were wrong. I understood that historically, blacks did not have the equality that existed was a very dysfunctional caste system. It was okay and fine for my 5th grade teacher to be a black woman. It was also okay for all 5 feet 2 inches of her to wield a paddle against the rear end of any misbehaving child in the class. We all got to observe her perfect home run batting form as she sent Glenn Seibel flying into the coat closet with one mighty whack. That was the first and last time she had to use that to have a compliant classroom. She was trusted by whites to educate and discipline their children, and whites didn't think twice about hiring blacks as nannies and trusting their children's care. The message and arrangement was clear. We will trust you to serve us, but you are not one of us. By the time we moved to California in 1969, I was more than ready to leave. I was done with the Deep South culture, and my increasing awareness of racism was a big part of that. Years later, I learned that the husband of the church organist there had been a member of the KKK. This was the first time I recall struggling with the disconnect of racial hatred in those professing to be Christians. My formative years in California were a step up from the lower middle class to middle class. We moved from a 1,300 square foot home to a 1,455 square foot home. Again, the neighborhood was primarily white, and being California had a sizable Asian population. Of my three best friends in high school, one was white, one was Chinese, and one was Japanese. And this very subtly reinforced my non-racist view of myself and tended to reinforce the socioeconomic aspect of racial segregation in society. My career was in a variety of high-tech industries, working my way up from the bottom to the executive level. I attributed that climb up the ladder to hard work and my accomplishments along the way. The thing about high tech is that it tends to exist predominantly white areas. My career took me from Silicon Valley, California, to southern New Hampshire, to Scottsdale, Arizona, and then to San Diego, California. While I worked with blacks along the way, hired several, and actively promoted EEOC, the world of high tech remained, and remains today, predominantly white. I made no intentional choice to work in a predominantly white industry, and as a result live predominantly white neighborhoods. There's nothing about my career that was intentionally racist, nor was there any intention to raise my children in predominantly white neighborhoods where they would get a good education so they could also have careers in predominantly white industries and live in predominantly white neighborhoods. But that is the result. As Robin points out on page 55, I consider myself as just people. When I take a walk in the evenings with my wife in our safe, somewhat rural neighborhood, I cheerfully greet the other whites and Hispanics that are out doing the same. True to my life to date, my immediate neighborhood is predominantly white. Oh, the Hispanics, you ask. Well, they live in the apartments a mile or more down the road, and occasionally a gardener might live in a neighbor's garage or tool shed. Barack Obama once said that anyone who has been successful has gotten their help of others or having been dealt a better hand. Now, many whites denounced this, loudly proclaiming they were self-made. Well, I previously stated that I climbed the business ladder due to my hard work and accomplishments along the way. Not too divergent thinking there on my part. However, living in Silicon Valley, California, presented a lot better opportunity to have a career in high tech than living in Augusta, Georgia. And being white in Augusta, Georgia offered me much greater opportunity than being black. And being born in the United States offered me an incredibly better opportunity than being born into a lower caste in India. Part of realizing our role in racism requires understanding and admitting the privileges that we enjoy and perpetuate. I'd like to talk about the good old days section that Robin has on page 59 through 61. She touches on the history and implications of white male privilege in the United States. I understand that for political reasons, especially with everything in the news these days, this section may have confronted and even angered some of you. It is important, however, to set emotion and politics aside and review this from a purely historical, factual perspective. When the country was founded, in order to vote, you had to be white, male, and a property owner. Through various changes to society and the Constitution over the next 200 years, those who did not own property were allowed to vote, and women were allowed to vote. and people of color were allowed to vote. Each of these changes was repeatedly resisted by the white males whose power was in jeopardy of being reduced. These changes only occurred over time and due to the activism, personal risk, and persistence of those seeking a voice in the political process. It is understandable that each of those groups would not consider the time before their voice was allowed to be heard as the good old days. For example, the 50s and 60s might be considered by white men as a time when America was great. Women might find that time period less so, especially in contrast to the advances in women's equality and opportunity since. And I doubt Blacks would consider that a great time at all. So I encourage you to review and consider what Robin shares in this section more deeply from this historical, and if you can, especially from a Black person's perspective. Some realizations, indictments, and challenges. I want to share a few of the statements in chapter 4 that particularly stood out for me. Some were experienced as new understandings, some challenged me to change, and some indicted me for behaviors I was not aware of. On page 64, Robin provides 3 reasons why, and I quote, "The expectation that people of color should teach white people about racism is another aspect of white racial innocence that reinforces several problematic racial assumptions," end quote. First, it implies that racism has nothing to do with me. Second, it requires nothing of me and reinforces unequal power relations. And third, it ignores the historical dimensions of race relations. This definitely indicted me. Guilty as charged. The Just People section was particularly revealing to me. I've been able to go through life without really having to consider racism. 1977, when I rode across country on a motorcycle wearing a black leather jacket, sporting a beard, and considerably more hair than I have these days, I purposefully avoided those states that I felt might not be very welcoming. But even then, I was not concerned about racism, but prejudice. Beginning on page 69, and through the end of the chapter, Robin discusses our segregated lives. It's easy to dismiss segregation as a deliberate institution of the past. Yet reading this section helped me become more aware of many ways that I'm segregated from others. I live in the United States, segregation 1. I'm white, segregation 2. I'm healthy, segregation 3. Happily married, segregation 4. I have healthy children and grandchildren, segregation 5. I live in a nice town and have a nice view from my back patio, segregation 6. I have health insurance, segregation 7. I was provided a good education and I was taught to think, segregation 8. And I was raised in a family that loved me, segregation 9. On and on and on. All of these segregate and disconnect me from others in many ways. As I've read and pondered white fragility, I've struggled with 2 things more than any other. First is the history of racism by Christians from the days of slavery to today. It proves that we are people of our society, culture, and upbringing first. As Paul would say, we're of the world, and we're Christians second. It is our nature to justify what we want to justify and ignore or exclude what supports our narrative. As previously mentioned, our nation's history includes the struggle of white men to remain on top, in power. Following Jesus seriously, which Christians should seek first and foremost, means giving up our desire for power. We must be willing to speak truth at personal risk. Am I willing to walk that path that Jesus or Martin Luther King Jr. or John Lewis walked? I wish I were, but I know I'm not. And until I am, I can refer to myself as a Christian, but I struggle with calling myself a true follower of Christ. The other thing I've struggled with is how to differentiate between my prejudices and racism. I have some very profound prejudices that are not race-based, but cut along attitudinal and life approach lines. These include people that exude arrogance and superiority, people that feel entitled and are self-indulgent, corrupt government officials, Christians that are promoting unchristian ideals, people that are not interested in truth but wholeheartedly believe conspiracy theories, people who intentionally degrade and harm others. And I admit, oftentimes I judge people as fitting into one of these categories by how they look and dress, how they speak, or who they're associated with. These prejudices cross racial and cultural boundaries. These prejudices overlap, influence, and confuse my racism tendencies, which makes it difficult for me at times to distinguish and pinpoint my racial biases against people of color. The confession and realization here is that I, not unlike most people, tend to like people that are like me in life approach and belief systems. People that I can connect with, support, and be challenged by. Race, economic status, education, job, those are not as important to me. If I take white fragility seriously, I must believe that just because I can intellectualize my racism as merely some broader reaching prejudices, that makes me even more blind to the roots of racism that society has planted in me, roots that I cannot so easily pull from the ground of my being. So I've asked Pastor Davis to help me, and perhaps you, be able to see and experience those roots in us. Pastor Davis is articulate, educated, handsome. He wins Best Dressed awards everywhere he goes. He's confident. Who else can rock a bow tie these days? Yet he's humble. And with absolutely no doubt, he's a caring, passionate, compassionate, committed Christian. Yes, he's Black. But aside from that, he's one of us. And because of that, we're able to be in relationship with him without the apparent baggage of racism. We like that because it serves our desire to feel unracist. So what I'd like to do is introduce you to Pastor Davis's alter ego that has not been whitewashed with all the things that make us feel like he's one of us. Pastor Davis' alter ego. Thank you for showing up. For anyone who doesn't know what that NWA on his shirt is, an abbreviation for, we encourage you to research that. Now, what if Pastor Davis's alter ego walked down your street, up your front door, into your store, or into your church looking in like that? At least some of you are having an emotional response right now. I encourage you to take a moment to explore what that response might be. Is it disbelief or concern that Pastor Davis might actually embrace some of his Blackness in this way? Are you angry or disturbed by seeing him this way? Are you amused? Are you relieved? Does seeing him this way affect your opinion of him? None of these responses are right or wrong, but they are opportunities for you to examine further in the coming weeks as we continue our journey and exploration into understanding our own white fragility. Racial innocence. To conclude my presentation, on page 62 in the section about racial innocence, Robin states that we are not racially innocent. I've articulated how my life has been pretty isolated from a true multiracial environment. How can I know much about racism if I have lived separately? Since I am white, I cannot truly know what it is to be a person of color. Just as a man, I cannot know what it is like to be a woman. Years ago, I hired a woman software developer. About a year later, after respect and trust had been established, she let me know that while she had been born male, as an adult, she had gone through transgender surgery and treatment to go from being a man to a woman. It was fascinating talking to her about how life was so different as a woman than as a man. She had had an idea what it would be like, but the idea was nothing like reality. I've been poor, but never homeless. I have some health issues, but none that debilitate. I've been treated badly by others, but I've always had those who loved me. I can point to challenges I've had in life that I could call unfair. But on the grand scale of things, I've lived a pretty charmed life. The only way I can know anything about racism is by being in intentional conversation with those who have experienced it. Just like the only way to know what it is like to be homeless or transgender or paraplegic or anything else is to ask someone what it is like. I still won't really know what it's like, but perhaps I'll have a better understanding, a different perspective, maybe experience some empathy and compassion, and just maybe, if I'm really fortunate, I'll be motivated into action on their behalf and willing to walk where I can and how I can with them.
Thank you, Don. Don has presented, and we have quite a bit of time remaining. So I'm going to take a risk here and allow people to unmute and make your statement or ask your question, and then allow for Don to respond to them. I have several questions that I have lined up, but I see Wayne has a question in the chat, and I would like Wayne to ask his question, then mute yourself, and then allow Don to answer the question, please.
Thank you. And on page 64, there's a quote, and you kind of referred a little bit to it. The implications of the idea that white racial hegemony doesn't just happen, but it's actively and passively, consciously and unconsciously maintained. Expand on that a little bit, please.
I think for me, it's somewhat like what I covered about being in high tech. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't like I decided I don't want to live around people of color. I want to live in white America. But that perpetuated, and it's not only perpetuated through my life, but it's perpetuated through my children's lives now. And that they're now grown and have good jobs. They're all living in areas that are predominantly white as well. And so there's that almost generation to generation, we can say, well, it wasn't my intent. I wasn't trying to be racist. It's easy to not feel racist about it. But I think it's really important, at least for me, to understand that that path has continued racism in some way.
Okay. I have several friends on board with this meeting, and one of my friends I was having a conversation with earlier today, and his name is Courtney, a fellow Jamaican, and he has some comments that we discussed earlier, and I would love for him to, if he's willing at this time, to unmute and state those comments. And we have about 10 minutes remaining, so keep that in mind, please, to respect other people. Courtney?
Hey guys, you said something interesting about transgender people. I'll say the other comments, but what you were talking about earlier was you need to understand the their difference or understand any of that. And I think sometimes that becomes an issue with so many people because you think that you need to understand what they're going through and what they're doing. And I don't think that's necessarily the point. I mean, you can obviously know that they have been going through something. There's the Black community, gay community, transgender community. I just think you need to be there for them and be the shoulder that they need to cry on, or be the person that's going to be their friend. Just to kind of put in my opinion with that, just to say it because I heard you say it. And then on top of that, me and Kenneth were talking about this when it comes to a lot of people that want to justify the never forgetting aspect of 9/11. And it doesn't make me mad. It just makes me upset that people would say, never forget 9/11, it killed hundreds of thousands of people, but then in the same breath want the Black community to forget 400 years of slavery, forget redlining, forget Jim Crow, forget segregation, forget everything. And I think that that's so, it blows my mind for it. And I would love to hear your opinion on it. And if anyone else has an opinion on it, because I would love to hear that. Because if people put it into perspective like that, I don't think they would be so quick to have the responses that they do and have so much hate and being filled with that.
Okay, Don, do you or anyone else care to respond?
I'd love to. Thank you, Courtney. Actually, you've found some of the soft flesh there in your response, which I really appreciate. That indeed, certainly as Christians, we should just be able to accept and not need to understand. And that's a place of growth for me, certainly, and that's a place I think of growth for many people. What has helped? What I think helps overall is understanding, and perhaps we're defective as people because we want to understand before we have empathy. We should, as Christians, have empathy first and then seek understanding. But I think the path that I've led and the path that others have led is being exposed to something so they understand it. I'm just thinking of John McCain being homosexual until he found out that his daughter was, and that changed his perspective because he was confronted by it and realized that his love for his daughter was greater than that. My experience with this transgender woman made me more empathetic. Not that I had to understand that first, but the experience of just talking through that and getting that whole perspective was very helpful for me. Don Lemon, who I like to listen to on, I guess it's CNN, he said a while back, he said, if you're a white person and you don't have a black friend, then get one. If you're a black person, you don't have a white friend, then get one. And I think that that's really important for this discussion, especially from the white community, us being able to think of ourselves as normal and everyone else is abnormal, that unfortunately we've got just as many centuries of keeping the blacks down, of keeping ourselves on top, and that's really contaminated the way we think and view. So that's really important that you bring that up, and that's the best that I can respond, but I really appreciate your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Don. We have another question in queue, and it's actually from one of our future co-presenters who will be a part of this, and that's Dr. Rebecca Chan from San Jose State University. Dr. Chan, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for your talk, Don. Hearing like the opening quote and then what you just said in your most recent response, and then also what you said about growing up in the South, sort of reminded me of something like high school basketball teammate told me. So she had just moved to Arizona from South Carolina, and she was telling us about how a lot of parents in South Carolina who were like pro-life and wouldn't ordinarily let their daughters get abortions if they got pregnant in high school would actually force them to have abortions if they found out that the father was Black. And I've been thinking a lot about how people often claim that they're not racist because they have a Black friend, even though I'm sort of suspicious that they really are friends when people say things like that. But even if they were, isn't the better litmus test whether we would welcome people of other races into our families? And it seems especially important for Christians since presumably we want to invite everyone into the family of God. And then sort of attached with, sorry, this is the last thing. A lot of men seem to like find having a daughter illuminating when it comes to like sexual harassment and the way that we treat women in our society. And I think this is like sort of a problematic way of thinking about these types of issues. But I wonder if something might also apply to like if white people considered what it would be like to have a Black child. like not just from the standpoint of like what Black parents must have to go through in raising their children, but also in terms of like policy and structural standpoints and the type of society you would want in place for your child.
So Don, there we have a question that a professor would ask, and we have about 1 minute to give you to reply to that. So sorry about that.
That's all right. My response is an emotional one, that as white people, we don't know the concerns. My wife and I are really concerned about what's going on in the world today. And we talk about Pastor Kenneth and his daughters and how he must struggle with worrying about them being Black women in a white society. And even further for Blacks who have Black sons that they're concerned about. And so from my perspective, it's something that I can only imagine how that impacts their lives. I can't really answer your question. I just have to give you my emotional response to what you triggered in me.
Yeah. I want to take this opportunity again. This is not intended to be an in-depth conversation around this particular chapter that we're looking at each week, but it's really supposed to be a conversation starter for you as you continue this journey with us through this 12-week study. A question that I'd like to ask you as we close, and I gladly accepted Don's invitation to do this transformation from the red, white, and blue look, American look, to the kind of image that you are looking at right now. And the question that I would like to ask you, which image of me was less threatening or more threatening to you? Which image of me would you more likely invite to your home? Which image of me would you prefer me be a partner to one of your children? I leave you with that thought as I invite you to come back and join me and the other guests and Professor Rebecca Chan as we look at chapter 5 next week. Thank you for being with us. God bless you, and God bless America.
Tempted and tried.